Our passage is from 1 John 4, 1 through 6. I've titled this talk, Life from God's Invisible Realm. Life from God's Invisible Realm. There's a wonderful story about D.L. Moody while he was in England ministering. You may know that Moody was a plain man, a shoe salesman, but had a tremendous effect on people. And a man named Denny, who was a well-known theologian, made a point of following him around and studying him for several weeks while he was ministering. And finally, he came to him and said, in a way that may seem rather tactless, "Mr. Moody, it's certain that God's blessing is on your work, because otherwise there's no possible way of being able to explain your effect." Moody smiled and replied very simply by saying, "I would indeed be very sad if it were not so." You see, this is what the Christian longs for. This is what this passage is talking about, and this is what we are being invited into. And it's this vision of a life where we begin to work in a power that is beyond ourselves. Some helpful background to our passage is John 14, verses 15 through 19. And so here, Jesus is getting ready to make the transition from the time when he was with his people, teaching them, to the time when he was not going to be with them any longer. And they were distressed, as we all can very easily relate to. And they really didn't understand what was happening to them. In verse 15, Jesus says, "If you love me, keep my commandments, and I will pray to the Father, and he shall give you another comforter to be with you forever." Now, when we think of this, who was their first comforter? Well, it was Jesus himself. And so he's saying that as I'm leaving, I'm going to send a replacement, another comforter. He goes on in verse 16, "Even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you." Why can't the world receive the Spirit of God? Because it doesn't see him. The Spirit is not visible, and the world is tied to visibility. Now, that's absolutely critical for us to understand, because we are living before a God who works with us in the spiritual realm. And the spiritual realm is not visible. And if we have a problem with that, we have a problem with our faith. And what I mean is this: if your life is keyed only to what is visible, you're going to be severely hindered in your efforts to grow spiritually. Because to grow spiritually means to grow in what is invisible. In verse 19, "I will not leave you as orphans. Yet a little while the world will see me no more, but you will see me." Now, the next stage of coming into contact with Christ is that we begin to see the invisible. Our awareness of the invisible world is so sharp that the difference between the visible, the natural world, and the world of the Spirit is so clear that we come to see the spiritual world as the most real world. Now, when you begin to understand this, you begin to understand the behavior of people in the Bible and people like D.L. Moody. You begin to recognize that what's going on is that they are interacting with a different world. This is what we see in our passage today. In verses 2 and 3, this ability to recognize how God is at work in our world, at work in our circumstances, as well as how the spirit of falsehood, all that opposes Jesus Christ, is at work. It can be subtle, and we can become blind to it. So John says in verses 2 and 3, "By this you know the Spirit of God, Every spirit that confesses Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of Antichrist, which you have heard was coming and now is in the world already. What we begin to see is that as spiritual beings, we have a different center. Our center is Jesus Christ. He is from God. He has come in the flesh, and he abides in us. And what is happening is that reality is taking over our lives, and we're acting as if that is really true. You see, one of the things we have to understand is that faith is vision. That's what Hebrews 11 is talking about and shows us these great men and women of faith. Faith is not trying to believe. Faith is perception about the realities of God. It looks at God and it sees God and his world and acts as if they were there. Trying to believe, we see others who try to believe, whose eyes have not been opened to this world, and they are actually continuing to react only on natural principles, following their own desires, taking care of themselves, and acting as if the only thing that they had any contact with at all was this present world. So that whenever they're in a situation of choice or decision, they go for the things that the natural person would go for. So as we begin to think about what John is trying to communicate to us, why is the incarnation so critical for us who believe? Why is it so important that this is the basis of the vision we have for the life that we're stepping into? There are many things that could be said about this. I'm just going to give you one. If we begin to take Jesus' incarnation seriously, if we grab a hold of it with both hands, it will completely change our understanding of greatness. Because God's understanding of greatness is diametrically opposed to the world's standard. In 1 Corinthians 1, 26 and 27, Paul says this, "Think about when you were called. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong." Because the world is locked into the visible. And it just assumes that this is the way to be great. And if God were to come on earth, if the Messiah were to arrive, you would expect that in every category, the Messiah would be that much greater. But God didn't simply, when he sent his son into the world, go around these standards. He shamed them. He showed that they were utterly superficial and that anyone who is truly wise will recognize just how misguided they are. To conclude our time and to bring this home to our lives, we had talked last week about life in God's family as life of interaction with God. We said that one way to think about it is about a life of prayer, a life of talking to God about what we're doing together. Another way that we might be able to think about this is as a life of discipleship, a life in which I am the student and Jesus is my teacher, and he's teaching me how to live in the kingdom of God. This idea of discipleship as being with him, learning to be like him in order that I can live my life as he would live my life if he were me. You see, when Jesus was here, when he walked the earth, discipleship was one thing. Now it's got to be another thing. And we have to ask ourselves and answer the question, how are we with Jesus today? What is he teaching me? What am I learning from him? And what is our part in being with him today? one of the things that we need to remember is that he sent us another comforter. He has not left us alone. The great promise is that God will be with us. And so, as we think about these things, I would like you just to open yourselves up to the possibility of receiving his abundant resources for the tasks that are at hand. That as you follow him, as you seek to obey him, as you seek to enter into his type of life, that you would find his upholding strength and support and comfort. To conclude, I just want to read Romans 8:11. If the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life, a different kind of life, to your dying bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. May God bless you. Thank you.